You know those true crime cases that just, they pull you right in? The ones with so many twists and, like, conflicting pieces of evidence it feels impossible to figure out?
Definitely. Where every new detail just seems to point somewhere else entirely.
Well, that's exactly the kind of case we're tackling today.
Absolutely. We're doing a deep dive into a case that's, well, it's really blown up. It's got conflicting stories, evidence that's heavily disputed, and now a retrial that everyone is watching very closely.
We're talking about the death of Boston police officer John O'Keefe back in January 2022.
Right, and the legal proceedings involving his girlfriend, Karen Reed.
Exactly. And look, to really try and get our heads around this, we've pulled together a ton of information. We've got Reddit threads breaking down evidence, NBC 10 Boston analysis on YouTube about the retrial.
Insights from a juror from the first trial, which is fascinating. Official case documents, summaries on juror views of the lead investigator, timelines from Court TV.
Yeah, news reports from Fox News, The Independent covering the retrial kickoff, the defense's whole theory about an inside job, detailed timelines, key players.
A legal summary, even a Q&A tackling some key questions. It's a lot.
It is. So our goal here really is to pull out the most crucial stuff, the most intriguing parts of this case. Try to bring a bit of clarity to all these clashing narratives and, help make sense of what's happening in this ongoing retrial.
Okay, so where do we start? I guess the beginning.
Yeah.
The initial scene, right? And the completely different stories about what happened.
Right. So Karen Reed's version is she drops John off at this house party. It's maybe 12:15 a.m. They'd been out drinking.
But here's the first big sticking point. Nobody who was inside that house says they actually saw John O'Keefe come in. Not one person.
That's a huge divergence right from the jump. One of those core stories has to be, well, wrong, or at least seriously flawed.
It really puts you in a position where you have to decide early on which narrative seems more plausible, doesn't it? And that initial perception can shape everything.
So hours go by. Karen starts making these frantic calls, saying John never came home from the party.
And then when they eventually find his body around 6 a.m. lying in the snow outside that house, there are these alleged statements from her. Things like, John is dead.
And crucially, I hit him. Which, obviously points towards her thinking she might have accidentally hit him with her SUV while backing up.
But then the defense comes in and paints a completely different scenario.
Totally different. They argue he was actually beaten up inside the house during that party, and then someone moved him outside and just left him there in the snow.
So right there, you have these two completely opposing narratives from minute one, and that really sets the stage for everything else.
Okay, so building on that, the physical evidence found at the scene is obviously critical. Let's talk about the broken taillight from Karen Reed's SUV.
Right. So police recover, I think it was 45 pieces, shattered red and clear plastic near where John's body was found. And these pieces are consistent with her Lexus SUV's taillight.
Okay, seems straightforward enough. But then, this is where it gets complicated, isn't it?
Uh-huh. Because one of the first responders, someone on the scene very early, initially stated they didn't see those pieces of plastic there.
Didn't see them. So were they there or weren't they?
Yeah.
That immediately makes you think, well, could they have been put there later?
And that's exactly what the defense argues. They seize on that. They say, look, maybe these pieces were planted after the police already had her SUV. It fits their narrative of a frame-up.
So what's the prosecution's explanation for the first responder not seeing them?
They basically said, well, it was snowing heavily at the time. Maybe the snow just covered them up initially.
But the defense pushes back on that too, right? Didn't they say there was actually more snow on the ground later when the pieces were eventually found?
Yeah, it becomes this whole debate about, snowfall rates and timing. It's really granular.
Okay, what about other evidence linking the car?
Well, there's testimony that pieces of plastic consistent with that same taillight were found on John O'Keefe's clothing.
Which sounds pretty damning for the defense.
It does, on the surface. But then the defense immediately attacks the chain of custody for those clothes.
Ah, right. The chain of custody, basically, the documented trail of who handled the evidence and when, if that's broken or questionable.
Exactly. They raise doubts about how carefully the clothes were handled, who had access, could the plastic have gotten onto the clothes after they were collected. It introduces that element of reasonable doubt, even if the plastic matches.
And there was security footage, too.
Right.
From John's house.
Yes. Security camera footage shows Karen backing up her SUV earlier that night at John's house. She gets pretty close to his vehicle, maybe even makes slight contact.
But no taillight pieces were found there at his house.
Nope, none found there. And the video quality itself is apparently not great.
So it's ambiguous.
Very. Some people look at it and are convinced the taillight is intact before she leaves for the party. Others see what they think is existing damage. It doesn't seem to offer a clear answer about when that taillight actually broke.
Ambiguity seems to be the name of the game here. Okay, so if the physical evidence like the taillight is debatable, what about John's injuries themselves? The defense has some alternative explanations there too, right?
They do. First off, the medical examiner found the cause of death was blunt force trauma combined with hypothermia. But crucially, the manner of death was listed as unknown.
Unknown, meaning they couldn't definitively say accident, homicide, or something else. And they didn't rule out an altercation.
Exactly. Which leaves the door open for the defense's theory of a fight inside the house, and then things get even stranger.
How so?
2 pathology experts brought in by the defense looked at injuries on John's arm scratches, some puncture wounds, and suggested they looked like animal bites, maybe from a large dog.
A dog? Wait, wasn't there a dog at the house where the party was?
Uh-huh. The homeowners, the Alberts, had a German Shepherd, and apparently this dog had a history of aggression.
Wow. And what happened to the dog?
It was rehomed not long after John O'Keefe died.
Okay, that's interesting. But what did the prosecution's forensics say about that? Was there dog DNA?
Well, that's where it gets conflicting again. A forensic scientist testified she tested swabs from John's shirt and found no canine DNA.
No dog DNA. So case closed on the dog theory.
Not quite.
Yeah.
Because under cross-examination, she apparently admitted she couldn't be 100% certain where on the shirt those swabs were actually taken from, so maybe they swabbed the wrong spot.
More ambiguity. And the defense had their own expert on the injuries, too.
Yes, a retired emergency physician who looked at the arm injuries and stated that, in his professional opinion, they were consistent with dog bites.
So you have experts looking at the exact same injuries and coming to opposite conclusions.
Precisely. And then you add in the crash reconstruction experts. These are people who analyze the physics of accidents.
What do they say?
Their reported finding, at least according to the defense filings, was that it was physically impossible for Karen's SUV, traveling at the speed calculated from the car's data recorder, about 24 mph in reverse, to cause the specific injuries John had.
Really? Physically impossible.
That was the term used in some reports on their findings. They argued his injuries just didn't match that kind of impact.
Can you remind us what some of those specific injuries were?
Sure. There were the scratches and puncture wounds on the arm we mentioned, bruises on his hands. He had those raccoon eyes, the bruising around both eyes, often linked to head trauma or skull fractures, and a lump, a cut, and another scratch on his head. The defense argues that whole pattern just doesn't scream hit by a car. It looks more like injuries from a fight, potentially.
Okay, so the injuries themselves are another major battleground.
Yeah.
Now let's shift to the investigation itself, because the defense has raised a lot of questions about how things were handled.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the biggest ones right off the bat. The house where John O'Keefe's body was found, the Albert house, it was never searched inside by the police.
Never. Why not?
The official reason given was that they didn't feel they had probable cause. Basically, not enough evidence to get a warrant to believe a crime had occurred inside the home.
Which, if you're the defense, sounds like a massive miss, right? Especially if you think he was attacked inside.
Exactly. It feeds their narrative that the police maybe zeroed in on Karen Reed too quickly and missed potential evidence inside. It raises questions about confirmation bias.
And then there's how some evidence was collected at the scene in, like, plastic cups.
Yeah, red plastic cups and apparently a grocery bag were used to collect some evidence initially. The police explanation was that the weather conditions were terrible, blizzard conditions, and they had to improvise to protect potential evidence.
Okay. Maybe understandable given the weather, but still doesn't sound ideal. What about the connections between the police and the homeowners?
That's another significant point for the defense. There was a police sergeant involved early on who was reportedly quite close, personally, with the Albert family, the homeowners.
Close friends.
Close enough that the defense suggests it could have influenced how the investigation was handled, maybe led to favorable treatment or overlooking certain things. And there are also accusations about how witnesses were interviewed at the scene. Specifically, that this sergeant didn't separate witnesses properly, interviewing them within earshot of each other.
Which could definitely taint their recollections, let them influence each other's stories.
Right. Standard procedure is usually to separate witnesses immediately.
Okay, we absolutely have to talk about the Google searches. Jennifer McCabe, who was inside the house. The search for how long to die in cold.
Yes, this is a huge point of contention. Her testimony was that she made that search around 6:17 a.m. after John's body had been found.
But the defense says otherwise.
The defense presented analysis from digital forensic experts suggesting that the initial search might have actually happened much, much earlier, around 2:27 a.m.
2:27 a.m. That's hours before he was found.
Exactly. If that time is accurate, it's highly suggestive, isn't it? It implies someone inside that house might have known or suspected someone was outside in the freezing cold long before the official discovery.
So how do they explain the discrepancy? How can there be two different times?
Well, the prosecution's expert explained that if you reopen the same browser tab later, like McCabe said she did around 6 a.m., the metadata could potentially make it look like the earlier search time was the primary one. It's technically complex.
But the defense experts disagree with that interpretation.
Right. They maintain that their analysis shows the 2:27 a.m. time is the legitimate initial search time. So it's basically a battle of the forensic tech experts, dueling analyses.
Wow. Okay, what else raised red flags for the defense about people at that party?
Well, there's the homeowner, Brian Albert. He reportedly deleted the entire call log and data from his cell phone right around the time the police asked for it.
Deleted everything. What was his explanation?
He claimed it was a coincidence, that he was just planning to get a new phone anyway.
And weren't there some weird phone calls or butt dials involving him too?
Yes, supposedly some very late night or early morning butt dials to another person who was at the party, followed by actual calls to that same person, and even the police chief right after John's body was discovered. It certainly raises questions.
And then there was another figure, an ATF agent, Brian Higgins.
Right, Brian Higgins. He apparently had some kind of romantic interest in Karen Reed. The defense has pointed to him as well.
Why him?
Well, he also reportedly received butt dials from the homeowner, Brian Albert. He also got rid of his own phone shortly after John's death, and he apparently made inquiries about how difficult it is to extract data from phones.
Okay, so discarding phones, deleting data, weird calls.
Yeah.
It definitely paints a picture the defense wants the jury to see.
Absolutely. They suggest motive and opportunity for others beyond Karen Reed. Then you have other little things, like one witness saying she saw a black blob near the flagpole outside the house around 1:45 a.m.
A black blob.
Right.
A person.
Unclear.
Mm-hmm.
And importantly, no one else in the car with her corroborated seeing it.
And Karen Reed herself went back to the Albert house before the official search.
Yeah, apparently she went there with friends early in the morning before the police search for John really got underway.
Okay. And the snowplow driver. Didn't someone see a car there late?
Right. A snowplow driver reported seeing a Ford Edge, which is the type of SUV owned by members of the Albert family, parked at the house around 3:30 a.m. He said he hadn't seen it parked there earlier on his route.
But the police discounted his testimony.
They did. They apparently pointed to inconsistencies in his memory about other details from that morning, like the weather or road conditions, to cast doubt on his reliability regarding the car.
So all these different threads. The defense is essentially weaving them together to say the investigation was flawed from the start, possibly biased, and missed the real story.
That's the core of their argument, which leads us directly to the lead investigator himself, Trooper Michael Proctor.
Right. We mentioned the personal connection to the Albert family. He'd asked them about babysitting his kid.
Yes, but it's really his text messages that became explosive.
Just how bad were they?
They were. Pretty shocking. Highly inappropriate, derogatory language about Karen Reed, commenting about hoping she sent news, calling her offensive names, even texting things like he wished she would kill herself.
Wow. That's incredibly unprofessional, to say the least, for a lead investigator.
Absolutely. And beyond the personal text, there was another text that seemed to imply the homeowner, Brian Albert, being a Boston police officer, would essentially be protected or looked after in the investigation.
So that feeds directly into the defense claim of corruption and bias.
Yeah.
That Proctor was protecting friends and had it out for Karen Reed from day one.
Precisely. And we know it had an impact. A juror from the first trial specifically called the texts very surprising and very unprofessional. It strongly suggests that the first jury likely discredited much, if not all, of Proctor's testimony.
And Proctor was eventually fired, wasn't he?
Yes, he was terminated by the Massachusetts State Police following an internal investigation related to this case.
It's hard to see how the prosecution overcomes that. It's just cast such a shadow over the entire investigation's integrity.
It's a massive hurdle for them, no question. But, shifting gears slightly, there is forensic evidence that does point towards Karen Reed. We should cover that too.
Okay, right. What specific forensic findings support the prosecution's case?
Well, importantly, John O'Keefe's DNA was found on a piece of that broken taillight from Karen's SUV.
His DNA on the taillight.
And his hair was also found in the wheel well of her vehicle. So that physically links him to her car around the time of the incident.
And the car's computer data. You mentioned the speed.
Right. The SUV's data recorder showed that rapid reverse acceleration 0 to 24 miles per hour in about 10 seconds, covering nearly 100 feet in reverse. That happened right around the time she says she dropped him off.
Which the prosecution argues shows her hitting him, accidentally or otherwise.
That's their interpretation. But then, counteracting that, you have the data from John's own devices.
The Apple Watch and phone GPS.
Yeah. It's really confusing. The Apple Watch data apparently suggested movement consistent with maybe climbing stairs after he supposedly would have been dropped off outside.
Yeah.
And his phone's GPS data at one point seemed to place him about half a mile away from the Albert house around that critical time.
Half a mile away? How is that possible?
It's unclear. GPS isn't always perfectly accurate, especially in poor weather, perhaps, but it adds to the confusion.
And didn't his health app show activity after he died?
Incredibly, yes. The Apple Health app on his phone apparently registered him taking steps after the time he'd been pronounced dead, which really highlights how unreliable this kind of digital data can sometimes be, or at least how open to interpretation it is.
Man, it really feels like for every piece of evidence pointing one way, there's something else pushing back the other way.
Yeah.
It's just murky.
It is exceptionally murky, which
All right.
explains why the legal process has been so drawn out.
So let's recap the legal side. What were the specific charges against Karen Reed?
She was charged with second-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, and leaving the scene of a crash causing death.
And the first trial ended how?
It ended in a mistrial. The jury deliberated for, I think, 5 full days, but just couldn't reach a unanimous verdict on all charges.
And weren't there reports about how the jury was leaning?
Yes, there were reports unconfirmed officially, but widely reported that the jury was actually unanimous on finding her not guilty of the second-degree murder charge and the leaving the scene charge.
Not guilty on those two, but deadlocked on the third.
Right. They were reportedly deadlocked specifically on the charge of involuntary manslaughter.
Interesting. Did the defense try to use that to stop a retrial?
Oh, absolutely. They argued double jeopardy, essentially saying, look, the jury already acquitted her on the most serious charges. You can't retry her. But the judge ultimately disagreed and allowed the retrial to proceed.
So here we are now in the middle of that retrial. Same charges.
Same charges, same judge presiding over the case. But there's a new special prosecutor, Hank Brennan, leading the case for the state this time.
Okay, and what are we seeing in terms of strategy? Is the defense approach different?
It seems like they're doubling down, maybe even more aggressively, on the crash reconstruction experts and, of course, hammering away at the flawed investigation angle. They brought up Proctor's texts right away in their opening statements.
No surprise there. And the prosecution, what's their opening move?
Well, interestingly, they played clips from Karen Reed's interview on Dateline during their opening, trying to use her own words, her own account against her, painting her as responsible from the start.
And I heard something about the judge limiting talk about other suspects.
Yes, the judge ruled that the defense couldn't explicitly name Brian Albert or Brian Higgins as alternative suspects in their opening statement. They can't just point the finger directly right at the beginning.
But they can still introduce evidence pointing towards them later.
Exactly. The judge said they can develop that evidence as the trial goes on, if they have it. So the possibility of third-party culprits is still very much on the table legally.
And how long is this retrial expected to last?
The current estimates are somewhere in the range of 6 to 8 weeks. So, yeah, another long haul.
It's really quite something. This case started locally, but it feels like it's become this huge global true crime obsession.
It really has morphed into a phenomenon, hasn't it? A worldwide true crime celebrity case, as some have called it.
Why do you think it's captured so much attention?
Well, I think partly it's the relatable elements, maybe. You know, a night out with friends, drinks, something goes tragically wrong. But then layered on top are these huge questions about police conduct, potential cover-ups, the reliability of evidence. It touches a lot of nerves.
And Karen Reed herself has gained a very large, very vocal group of supporters who believe she's innocent.
Absolutely. There's a significant Free Karen Reed movement, people convinced she's being framed by connected insiders. It taps into that distrust of authority, that feeling that maybe the system isn't always fair.
Okay, so As we kind of wrap up this deep dive for today, let's just quickly boil down the key issues again. It's incredibly complex, still unfolding.
Definitely. You've got these completely conflicting stories of what actually happened to John O'Keefe that night. Did she hit him with her car, or was he attacked inside?
Then you have all the disputed forensic evidence, the taillight pieces where they planted, the injuries consistent with a car crash or a dog attack or a beating, the DNA and hair linking her car, but then the confusing digital data from his watch and phone.
And looming over everything are these really serious questions about the investigation itself, the potential bias of the lead investigator, the missteps like not searching the house, the connections between police and witnesses.
Right. And now we're watching this retrial play out, which is bound to bring even more arguments, more expert testimony, maybe even more confusion before we get any kind of resolution.
It's just a case where clear, definitive answers seem incredibly hard to come by. The search for truth here is, well, it's messy.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening to mull over. When you consider everything we've talked about, the conflicting stories, the questionable evidence, the whole controversy around the investigation, what parts of this case really stand out to you as the most, I don't know, unsettling, or the most suggestive of one outcome over another? And maybe, what does this whole saga tell us about how hard it is to find the truth in situations that are this complicated and this emotionally charged?
It's definitely a lot to think about, and something to keep in mind as we all continue to watch how this retrial unfolds over the next few weeks.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive today.